Welcome to the Cannabis Detector Podcast. No sugar, all spice. With the industry BS detector in residence, Kristen Yoder. This episode is part of a special series covering the financial aspects of the cannabis industry.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another special episode of All Things Green with my co-host with the most, Colby McFadden.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, holding up in this time of COVID crisis.
Yeah, there are literally worse places to be isolated than the places that we're at currently.
Yeah, it's not so bad. I mean,
yeah,
the
totally.
Sun's out.
Yeah, exactly. It was beautiful. I was out on my lounge chair and my deck yesterday just thinking how funny that it's going to take COVID-19 to get me to actually start getting 15 minutes of sunlight on my skin, for the vitamin D.
Yeah.
All I needed was the threat of a pandemic,
Just took a virus to make it all happen.
Yeah, isn't it funny how that works?
Oh, yeah.
Well, anyways, so we've been chatting back and forth, and obviously there's a lot going on that is interrupting everything that we know. This is unlike any other situation that pretty much anyone has ever been through, but especially our new industry, cannabis. So young, and now after all of the other bullshit that has happened, we have a pandemic. So first we should start where things were at, things that we've called out in previous episodes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a lot of things that we've talked about that have kind of transitioned. I think the most recent that I saw, that was some information and news just about how management staffs are changing at this stage. And that's something that we talked about in our last episode of how, there's a difference between a CEO that's a money raising, capital raising, entrepreneurial, growth oriented CEO, as opposed to somebody who may be a numbers guy that's good from an operational standpoint, or a turnaround person. And we're now really seeing that in the industry, where you're seeing a lot of the original founders or, people who are very popular stepping down, and a new regime starting to step in.
I would be really interested to know the exit packages all of these guys leave with, They got their companies to a really amazing point, out of sheer inflated valuations, and everyone investing and tons of capital. So granted, they earned their money in a lot of ways, but I just wonder what they're walking away with.
Well, my guess is a lot of paper. I mean, if you look at how the industry has grown, and even all the different mergers and acquisitions that we've seen, they've all been in paper and stock. So I don't think there's a lot of people walking away with a lot of cash. I think what they're doing is they're walking away with a lot of paper and a lot of promises for the future. And, their dreams of getting rich in the cannabis industry have not necessarily panned out like they thought they would.
Well, what do you know? The 99% rule applies to everyone in the cannabis industry as well. That makes me feel a little better. I know I'm a bad person because I am like, you got fucked too. But they're the ones who fucked a lot of people too. So not all of them, just some of them.
And I would be more concerned as an investor right now, in the sense of, if I was an early investor, if I was early in some of the more popular names, and I was in the seed rounds or the Series A rounds, or anything prior to, let's say, Series A, and now that enterprise is back at the trough or needing money at this particular time, when things are in the midst of a liquidity crisis, it really puts the early investors at some potential risk, because it's very common that in these situations, a new secondary investor could come in, and if they're writing a check at the time when people are desperate and the first round of investors aren't willing to put money in, good money after bad, a lot of people could lose their senior secure positions, or if they were in the primary spot, if a industry liquidated where they were getting paid back first. Yeah, if a company needs to raise money in these circumstances, those investors might get pushed back to a secondary position, and they may have no choice but to accept it if they don't want to lose the first investment. So these times have a way of really kind of changing an industry and the leaders of the industry, and especially the capital providers of an industry. And that's why many times it's not always the first mouse that gets the cheese, as we've talked about before.
Yeah, and thus begins the era of big cannabis that we have not seen yet. These are the guys that have been waiting on the sidelines. This is the real money, not the Wild West, take a risk, going to make a ton of money, guys. These are big ag. In my opinion, this is the time when this is when everyone starts to sell out. And it's not, I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think we've had it before, but it's tough because when you get in a position like now, COVID-19, like nobody had this in their crisis plans. When you need a bailout, essentially, this is when everyone has to sell just to survive. And I know a lot of people that are like, I would never sell out, craft will survive, whatever. But at the same time, things are different. Not for cultivation. People are actually buying cannabis. That's not a good example. But times come where, how are you going to turn down that money? Can you even turn down that money without your employees or your future or whatever? And this is how consolidation begins, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is basically how that process begins, because people get forced into making decisions that they didn't want to make. And it's because the capital wasn't available for them. And so, there's a playbook to these things, and every entrepreneur and everybody who's running an enterprise is going to have to make the decisions based on where that enterprise is. But in most cases, the playbook's going to tell you that if you have an enterprise and you're going into one of these crises, if you have credit lines or you have investors that are willing to extend you some credit or do another investment for some warrants, even if you have to take the dilution, it becomes one of those things where take the money while it's available. Especially if you have credit lines, draw them down, get the cash out of those things, because in 2008, we saw many times where people had credit lines, and since it wasn't being used, or whatever portion that hadn't been used, the bank came back and closed it, because that's exactly what happens in crisis. Is there's a demand for cash, and everybody's going to hoard cash. That's what puts stress on the banking system, and that's why now, like a day like today, you have the Federal Reserve stepping in and basically coming out to everybody saying, "Hey, we've got a bazooka, we've got a tank, we've got you name it. We've got the tools that we're not going to let the system fail." So the Fed has basically come out and said to everybody, "Hey, we don't have much control over the economy, but we sure can control the system, and we'll make sure there's enough money in the system." So it takes time for that to come through. But if you are an entrepreneur, an enterprise that has credit lines or has the availability to get some cash, do so. And then what you have to do is, unfortunately, you have to cut everywhere that you don't want to. And you have to cut anything that's non-essential and just get as skinny as you can and make very, very, very hard decisions.
I was talking to Mendocino Generations. I'm going to do a podcast with them. And when I first talked to them, they were really struggling, but I just was texting with them, and they were saying how they're doing really well. Because obviously people are stocking up on cannabis during these times because they're at home. And luckily, even though San Francisco, wait, is that the county? No, they're Marin County, I think. Anyways, 6 counties up in NorCal. Well, I guess all of us are on stay home type thing, cannabis businesses were fortunately ruled to be essential businesses, so they stay open.
Yeah.
So that's really good. I was wondering what you were thinking. What sectors do you think are really going to take the hit from COVID-19?
Well, I mean, the obvious is travel. I mean, that's right there in your face. Anything that's travel or leisure, restaurants, just everything that basically people can't go to like they were used to. So anything around the consumer just essentially shuts down.
So like consumption lounges?
Yeah, consumption lounges, I would imagine, would fall into that realm. When it's relatable to cannabis, that whole thing of essential business is different city by city, county by county. So, and states. So there are some states that have said, yeah, cannabis, and there's other states that have said no. And this becomes something that the cannabis industry needs to really start to formulate as an industry and start to say, hey, you know what, as an industry, we need to set these tones and these rules for government and tell them what's essential or not. And I think the cannabis industry is making a very, very big mistake by being passive. The number one thing you learn in chaos is you never let a good chaos go without taking advantage of it, right? Mm-hmm. And this is one of those times that we should be looking at it as an industry. And in my opinion, one of the things that has come up in conversation over the last few months a lot is that, hey, the moment that a state turns recreational, every value of the medical program goes out the window. Nobody's interested in it. Well, guess what? Here's a great way to help differentiate between medical and recreation and add some value to that medical card by, in these situations, saying, hey, you know what? Cannabis is essential as a medicine for those that have a medical card. If you're using it for recreation, it's obviously not essential. So maybe you're not the one coming in and sitting in the lobby, and only the people who have medical cards are, or, get the deliveries, whatever it may be. So, I mean, This is a point where I think the industry really does need to stand up, and rather than say to the government, oh, are you going to make us essential or not? Needs to step up and say, hey, this is how you make us essential. This is how we legitimize this process.
I mean, how much more do we need to lobby the government on this level? It's like, do we really COVID-19? I don't know, man. I feel like there's so many bigger issues going on, and our government is just failing all over the place that, lobbying the federal government for anything right now is a waste. And really what people need to do is focus on surviving and helping the medical patients. But I got to say, I don't want them to say recreationally it's not essential. So, that fucks the recreation market, because that's big. It should be both.
Oh, yeah. I, at a personal interest, I agree with you. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, my personal intake of cannabis in Casa Amigos tequila has increased significantly.
Me too.
So I don't want it to go away either. But, it just is one of those things where we have a moment that around some of the conversation points that I've heard in the past about difference between rec and medical, and how do we add more value to the medical program and this and that, and so here we are. Here's a perfect example of where we can do those things.
So I'm curious. So Series A investors, are they stuck in the company? Like, can they ever be like, okay, well, we're all about to get fucked because they're going to need a bailout, and those investors are going to dilute what we originally invested or whatever? Can they start pulling or cashing out, or do they sign a deal that says we're invested for 5 years or till you hit a certain revenue?
Yeah, in most cases, these are private deals, so there is a secondary market for private deals that does exist. It isn't robust for cannabis deals, but there is a very robust secondary market for private deals. Before Uber had, before they went public, they had a ton of private stock. And what happens in private companies, a lot of times, here's a great example. This was happening the last couple of years. You hire somebody as a new employee as part of the hiring package. You give them a bunch of stock options. those stock options are taxable to that person in that tax year. So, they go do their taxes in April and they have all these, this stock that they got as part of their hiring package. They got to pay tax on it, but they may not have the money. And so they have to sell some of those shares. And so they can go to the secondary market and they can sell their shares, but they're going to sell them at a discount. And so there are hedge funds and there are mutual funds and there are different financial institutions that are in that business of buying those private shares from private investors and holding on to them until a company goes public. But to directly answer your question is no, they're stuck in the deal. And if the company had to cut a deal to bring in financing that put other people minority in the cap, in the cap table, it's something that would have to be voted by the shareholders. In some cases, it could be a majority vote, which is 51% or more. Other cases, it could be a supermajority. In rare cases, it could be unanimous. Everybody would have to approve. And so it just all depends on how that shareholder agreement is kind of written up in these circumstances. But nonetheless, the investors are going to have a say in it, whether they have to agree or not agree. But it becomes one of those things that if you're an investor and a company is failing, you always are going to have the same choice. Do you put good money after bad, or because maybe that's just what they need to get over the next line, or do you cut your losses? And that's always a hard choice to make.
I mean, could you say you're an early investor in a company, and then a big company is like, we're going to bail you out, and that means that it will dilute their investment value of the original investors. I mean, have those investors ever fought to say, no, we don't want you to take the money because then we don't get anything? Or are they saying you should take the money because maybe we'll get something?
It's circumstantial at that. Both have happened, and it's just kind of what the circumstances are and who the investors are and the situation that the company finds itself in.
Stressful.
In most cases, when you get there, you're so far down. I mean, you're so far down the pipe that there's no turning back. Most of the time in those situations, people just don't have much choice. It becomes one of those. It becomes like the last election we had. Picking the best of two bad options. So it just that's where you end up being as an investor in these circumstances. But that doesn't mean there is an opportunity, because on the flip side of this, if you are an investor, let's say you are somebody who has cash or has been looking to get into the industry, this is a great time to be cutting deals, right? Because earlier you mentioned about people making deals that they would have never agreed to in the past. Well, real estate's a perfect example. 2 years ago, I'd be talking to people who had a cultivation facility or an extraction facility, and they bought the real estate that was involved in it, and they weren't going to leverage that real estate up. I mean, in the conversations, they were like, oh, I'll never do that. No, we own this. This is, and now all kinds of lease buyback programs are happening where people are saying, hey, I can't get capital other places. So yeah, you know what? I'll leverage up the property that I own here and try and get capital that way. So it's probably been a very good time for some of these guys that are extending loans or giving, issuing debt against properties within the industry.
Man, what a crazy time to be alive, right?
Yeah. It's quite exciting. Now, we've been here before. There's a textbook to these kinds of crisis things, and they go through, there's a rotation that goes through. And like in financial markets, when you look at the years like 2017 and 18, where the stock market really traded sideways, that's a time frame that we call a bear market that just buys time. It doesn't really crash. It doesn't really rip anybody's values out of their hands. It just churns sideways and buys time. But essentially what's happening in that is that money is kind of rotating through the different sectors of the market. Essentially, if one area of the market was really hot and popular, money just leaves that and goes into another one. So it stays in the market. It just rotates around. In these crises, and you get into these liquidity crises, you have the same kind of rotation, except now it's not rotating from one sector to another. It's actually coming out of the market because the money managers and the big funds are getting margin calls. And when you wake up in the morning and you have a margin call, the adage is, if you can't sell what you want, you sell what you can. So in the first few days, like we had last week and the week before, you just get unabated selling just across the board. And then when you get to the phase we are now, where you're a little bit deeper, the forced selling becomes kind of sectored out and into certain sections. And we're starting to see that right now. Markets as bad as they've been, we're starting to see where some of the operations are starting to come back to normal. And you're starting to see some liquidity start to move in the market. And so then there'll be this path of recovery that will go on. And as an investor, what you have to do is you have to be willing to accept losses. You have to be willing to accept drawdowns. If you're going to be invested for long enough, you're going to incur a loss, and you shouldn't be afraid of that. If anything, you should always have a plan B, which means I have plenty of cash, or I have some hedges. And a hedge is just anything you can invest in that doesn't go down as much as the stock market or your other investments. Because then when it's time for recovery, what you got to do is you got to get rid of your conservative stuff. You got to get rid of your cash. And then you just got to, hold your nose, close your eyes, and start buying the stuff that has been beat up the most. And you got to buy all the stuff that has the worst news. So same thing here in the cannabis industry. Some of the best opportunities will be wherever the news is the worst right now.
Interesting. Yeah. What is that thing you said? Buy ahead of the news. What's the thing? Sell by something, buy ahead of the news.
Yeah, I forget what that phrase is.
Yeah, I forget too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean,
so many of them.
There's an old adage in investing, which is, when everybody else is fearful, you should be greedy. And when everybody else is greedy, you should be fearful. It's the hardest thing to do as an investor, because if you go back to, let's say, January or December, before, all this broke loose, markets were making all-time highs, and everybody was looking out to the future going, oh, it seems so bright, everything. Yeah, sure, we're a little concerned about the election or this or that. But for the most part, people were really looking at the future as being bright. So at that time, everybody wanted to be in the market. I mean, people thought you couldn't lose. In fact, there's a whole generation of investors that have never been through a tough time. Even though 2008 was only, 12 years ago, there's still a lot of people who started investing in 2010, 2011, and they've never experienced what we're having right now. So it's really hard to follow that theory of being greedy when everybody is fearful, or fearful when everybody else is greedy. But it's really important to make sure that when things look great, you keep cash, you have dry powder, because when it turns fast, and you want to be able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, totally. So, for every cloud, there is a silver lining, and the silver lining is, while everything is dropping and people are losing their shit, buy.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I would wait a little bit longer, for maybe a week or two. Then I would buy.
Yeah, timing is always tough. Like right now.
Timing is important.
Yeah. And right now, here it is, March 23rd, and the market's maybe 3 weeks into this sell-off. So right now, it's kind of you're trying to grab a falling knife. And so for people that are more, fiscally responsible, or a little more prudent or conservative, when you have these kinds of drastic drops, it's not going to go right back up within a day. So you can take some time, and you should be patient. And you should think about this. You should be patient. And then when you start to deploy, you should think to yourself, okay, where do I put money? And for a guy like me, I look at it and I go, well, where's the government putting their money? So the government just came out, and the Federal Reserve is saying, hey, we're going to buy corporate bonds, and we're going to buy mortgage-backed securities, and we're going to buy this and that. Well, that kind of plays, gives you some ideas of, hey, if the government's going there, maybe that's a place to look. Because I would much rather sell stuff I'm buying in the next few weeks to the government, in a year or two, than buying it from the government at a higher price.
Interesting.
Yeah, so timing really matters, and I think anybody, they can take their time in this particular situation, because this is not like September 11th. September 11th is about your closest analog you could come to, because there was a day we woke up and everything was shut down for a week. But this isn't September 11th, because there's so many other variables. This isn't war. A lot of people will say, well, war, that's a stimulator. Well, that's not this case, because there's things that happen in war and have to be built. That's not what's happening here. So this is a very unprecedented situation, and that's why patience and time will pay off.
Yeah, because Lord knows we are not near the end by any means. So, well, I think that, is there anything else you want to say? I mean, the news is changing every day, and things are, I think we'll do another episode soon.
Yeah. I'll tell you that capital markets will improve long before the news does. So markets will bottom out, and capital, even in private markets, capital will flow before the news improves. So I would say that if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting an enterprise in the cannabis space or anywhere else, this is the time. As discouraging as it seems, this is the time that you want to spend a lot of time on getting your story straight, your deck solid, and you want to be out there talking to people now. And yes, you're going to get a lot of people who are saying, yeah, we're just kind of holding off. We're holding off. You want to be talking to people now, because most people aren't. And so when they do start to deploy capital, you want to be front of the line, and you want to be, right at the top of their mind at that time. So this is not the time for entrepreneurs to think that, hey, if they need capital, don't look for it. Quite the opposite. Look even harder now, because when the spigot turns back on, or if it turns back on, or when things change, you want to be ahead of the rest of your pack.
Totally. Awesome. Well, I need to get this handled and actually get this episode out, because Lord knows it takes me a minute. But this is time sensitive, because hello, pandemic. So, I've been quite paralyzed and just absorbed with the news and being like, holy shit, like, it's just not, I don't even know if it's really hit me yet until I know someone who has it. And then I'll be like, even though I went to Costco. That's the first time I've been outside out amongst others in 2 weeks. And God, it was nice. Like, it was wide open. There was no lines. It was amazing. It's because they were making everyone social distance and only letting in so many people at a time. So while there was a line outside, it wasn't that bad. And I wore a mask, and everyone looked at me like I was crazy. And I used to think that masks are only if you're sick. But hello, why do healthcare workers wear them? Because they don't want to get your particles in their mouth. And if it really lives in the air for up to 3 hours, there's no way I'm going to the Costco period without a mask, let alone to the pharmacy without a mask. And it hurt my face a lot, and I need to figure that out. But yeah, I'm wearing masks from now on in public, because it does not sound good from all the stories I've been reading,
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something you want to catch.
No, and I can't get Amazon Fresh delivery, and Instacart isn't working, and it's crazy, Yeah. But yet there's still these loud ass fucking motorcycles going up and down Venice Boulevard, and whatever.
Hey,
anyways.
People, the beach was packed on for Saturday because nobody had anything else to do. So
yeah, and now they're all closed.
Yeah.
Now it's illegal to go to the beaches or parks or hiking because people are stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But that must be nice, having a car and going and doing stuff. I'm jealous. But anyways, So I don't know if I'm going to include this rant in the episode, but This was a really good conversation, and I look forward to following this up soon because things are going to get increasingly bad. I mean, exponentially bad. And it'll just be interesting to see the ripple effects.
Yeah, if we follow the analogs that we're kind of seeing, like for instance, today in Italy, you actually have some hope because now you've got 2 days where the numbers in Italy haven't gotten worse, is something that I heard or saw. And now realize I'm not a news source, so I could be wrong on that. But a few people have mentioned that, and I've read it in a few different places that. So if that's the case, maybe we start. You've seen that it's trailed off in China. I saw a report from Hasbro Toys today that the supply chain for them is almost back to normal. They think within the next 10 days, they'll be operating fairly efficiently in China. So that seems to be coming back online. So now if you have Italy, which was the next really badly hit place, if that starts to taper off, then, you start to have a situation where things really start to look interesting because the government's come in with a fiscal response. They've come in with a monetary response with the Federal Reserve. And now the third leg that you need for this stool to be really steady is you need a response in the health area, which is either somebody to come out and say, we've got a vaccine, even if it's not going to be ready, for many, many, many months. That's fairly irrelevant to markets. They just want to know that it's there. Or you start to see that all the social distancing is working and all the numbers start to, that curve gets flattened. And so once you have that third part of that stool get placed, then, we'll start to see recovery. And the funny part or ironic part of that is the numbers here in the U.S. actually have to get worse in order for that process to really happen.
I mean, the number, oh my goodness, don't get me started on this. But hello, if we actually tested people, the numbers would be worse. When I hear the numbers in America, it's a joke because they're completely irrelevant. It's everywhere. And I mean, I just saw an article saying in LA County, they give up. They're like, it's out of control. So we're just not even going to test people. We're just going to assume they have it or whatever, unless their symptoms are really bad or something like that. They're not even tracing it. And I've read that epidemiologists are like, that is a terrible way of going about this. Like, you have to test and continue to do tracing and try and keep an eye on this and figure it out.
Yeah, well, I'm going to get all kinds of hate mail for saying this, but we are going to spend trillions and trillions of dollars to save a handful of lives in the big picture of things. So
is that not healthcare in general?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's just like, it's amazing to me that I think South Park had a little skit that was pretty funny where he said, and only 99% of us are still going to be here later. It just is what it is.
Yeah. We'll see how it goes. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast host. It really helps us get the truth out to a larger audience. You can follow us on Instagram at CannabisPod and on LinkedIn at the Cannabis Detector. Show notes and links to articles referenced in this episode are available on our website, cannabispod.com. Is there a topic you want to hear, or do you have some BS you'd like to tell our audience? Send us a message on Instagram at CannabisPod. Stay skeptical.